Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. High drama and qualifying for the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix with 4 different cars in the top 4 positions after qualifying. But the big story, Max Verstappen out in Q2 with a drive shaft failure. P15 he will start, he's going to have to do this one the hard way. Red Bull explain exactly what the issue was, what exactly failed, and what this means for the rest of the season. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. These were the numbers after FP3. Remarkable as it is, the pace in FP3 here, the differential between Alonso and the entire rest of the grid outside of Tsunoda, who only did a lap on the mediums, and De Vries didn't even do anything in FP3 because his engine failed, which is pretty interesting. We'll talk about Red Bull powertrains here in a second with AlphaTauri and Red Bull themselves, but the gap between Alonso in P3 and Bottas in P18 or whatever was less than the gap between Alonso and Max Verstappen in P1. Remarkable how good this Red Bull is. Is it good enough though around Jeddah to go from P15 to P1? We saw what Verstappen did last year in Spa, of course, going from P14 to P1 relatively easily. Might be more challenging tomorrow, might not be, we'll see. Verstappen still seems quietly confident here, and I wouldn't really blame him at all, but definitely it spiced up the weekend massively. Now, Ferrari, there were big questions here because they really hadn't shown much pace at all in practice, neither in the early part of Saturday either, and there were questions as to how they could actually close the gap to Red Bull, given they're clearly somewhat behind, but they reckon this circuit was going to be better for them, and it turned out to be to a certain extent. Now, De Vries, unfortunately for him, he had an engine issue on his car, and they had to change his power unit, which meant he couldn't do anything at all in FP3, had no track time at all. And again, right, a lot of teams right now experiencing some reliability problems. Yes, Ferrari, a big one right out there in Bahrain, but also some gearbox issues for Red Bull in Bahrain. Their car is undeniably one of the fastest relative to the field we've ever seen in Formula 1 history, that RB19. But even in Bahrain, they were losing, I think, 4/10 a lap because they had to tell their drivers to slow down due to a gearbox-related issue. And there was rumours circulating that we even talked about yesterday that those issues were rather more serious than were being let on, and that they were almost rather lucky to get to the end of that Grand Prix intact, such they were conserving pace to such a high degree, given how quick that car is. But it's not just Red Bull suffering from issues, AlphaTauri as well. These power unit issues, of course, related to the Red Bull powertrains engine, the Honda engine, whatever you want to call it, depending on whether they're winning or losing, I suppose, in the AlphaTauri, just like it is in the Red Bull. And last year they had some problems with that as well. Now, even earlier in the day, it was confirmed that Verstappen had replaced his gearbox. I believe you're allowed 4 of these per season. I think that's what Brundle said on commentary. So already they put another one in, mainly as a precautionary measure. But now this one might have failed as well, which means no penalty for Verstappen yet, but it does mean that one is probably coming. Now, it might not matter too much, all things considered, right, given how quick the Red Bull is, but it's still important nonetheless. Now, also, Lando Norris had an issue with his power unit. Now, this, of course, the Mercedes high-performance powertrain that's in the McLaren car, but I imagine this is related to the events of Bahrain rather than a Mercedes-related issue here, because we haven't really seen any other issues on the Mercedes car so far. But he says, yeah, the other one was finished after what happened in Bahrain. They had to keep coming into the pits to top him up with air, and clearly the engine wasn't happy with that and died. So they've got to have another engine in already. The second power unit out of 3 allowed on the second race. Not an ideal start for McLaren, and also not an ideal day for Norris either. Brundle mentioned before Quali that they seem to be nursing their power unit, and we'll see on a full race distance tomorrow whether Ferrari's power unit can survive. Again, they looked pretty good in Quali, but frankly not good enough relative to the Red Bull. So De Vries couldn't take part. He had an issue with his power unit, as we just mentioned. And let's dive into what happened in Quali. Then also got to mention here, just look at the numbers in terms of straight line speed. The Red Bull was rapid in a straight line. Verstappen was getting up to 339. The Ferrari's really only hitting about 333. Part of that is power unit related. Part of it is probably setup related as well. But it was quite clear from relatively early days in the weekend that Red Bull are rapid again around here on the straights, and it means that if you're not up on them significantly after sector 1, like, you've got no chance of getting P1. So De Vries going into turn 1 on his very first lap of the day, his rear tyres just locked up and he spun around. That wasn't ideal for him at all. Even Alonso did the same thing at turn 1 into turn 2. He got a bit too trigger happy, just like he did at turn 4 when he was defending from Hamilton in Bahrain, spun around again. And then Norris, this was a bigger surprise to me, into turn 27, smashed his car here onto the inside curb, and meant that his car was damaged to such a severe extent that I couldn't get him back out for Quali, despite the fact that McLaren do seem to have made a step with Piastri getting all the way to Q3 in a real great performance from him. So anyway, the bottom ones, I feel bad for Sargent, right, because he put in a stellar lap that would have been good enough to get him into Q2 at least, and that was deleted because he did basically in the F1 game, if you guys ever played that at all in Saudi Arabia, you will just hug the left-hand side so you can shorten the distance between P15, the final corner of the line, but you're not allowed to do that here. You're not allowed to put any tyre over the line on the left-hand side, and Sargent did that, got his lap time deleted, and after that he was pushing a bit too hard, spun it, got very lucky at turn 22 to not smash it into the wall, and then messed up his last lap as well, like at the first turn. So, unfortunate, probably he overheated a bit in his mind after the unfortunate first lap, but Albon also was out, so Williams were looking pretty promising, then it fell shy. So these were the times after of Q1, right, and it looked like, oh my god, Verstappen is up by 5/10 on Perez, then Alonso, then Stroll, then Leclerc, then Sainz, even Hülkenberg had a good lap here, and obviously we saw the 5 guys that were eliminated. I'll just put that fully so you guys can see exactly what was going on. But then, this was the key moment. Verstappen was off a decent first sector, it seemed, going down after, I believe, turn 10, going down to the banked turn 11, and his engine just decided to give up on him. He was on the radio, I've got an engine problem, and he admitted afterwards to the media that, like, yeah, he's obviously frustrated about this, right? He was very annoyed by this occurrence, but he didn't seem like, usually he might go on the radio and have an absolute rant against his team, which is understandable given how, heated it can get in those cockpits when it comes to a hectic Q3. But it does seem like Verstappen is so confident in his machinery that even if there is an issue today, he feels confident they can bounce back. But nonetheless, this really does throw, as the guy said many times on the broadcast, like, look, cat amongst the pigeons, right? Because Verstappen out in Q2, a big deal for the way this Grand Prix might go. Perez was on pole here last year and didn't win, arguably because of a safety car that was unfortunately timed for him, whereas Verstappen might be trying to take advantage of something like that if he intends to win tomorrow. But the engine failed, he was stuck in a certain gear, he had to put it into kind of like crawl back home mode effectively, and he just managed to get back to the pits with about 7 minutes on the clock, and they had a look at his car and were like, yeah, there's nothing we can do about this, no way this is fixable, and it was quite clear when you heard it, the audio, that like, yeah, that was done. Whatever failed, and it's not coming back anytime soon. So Verstappen was obviously quite clear, engine problem, and it was, we talked about after the fact, of course, he got out the car immediately because they knew it was done and dusted, and there we have it, Verstappen out in Q2, and that of course meant P15 for Max Verstappen. P15 on the grid tomorrow. Yes, Leclerc is not too much further up the grid than him anyway, just because of the engine issues caused by electronics he had in Bahrain, and therefore he's on a 10-place grid penalty anyway. But yeah, a Verstappen failure. Now, the question was, what exactly was this failure? Was it a power unit failure? Was it elsewhere? But it seems again to be going back to the gearbox issues that they potentially had. Even in FP2, I believe, yesterday, Verstappen was mentioning there were some issues with his downshifts, and it was the same problem he mentioned in Bahrain, right? He talked about the downshifting being an issue, the car wasn't responding, the gearbox wasn't responding as he wanted it to. That costs performance in pure lap time based on not the car behaving not how you want it to, but also it might have been putting extra wear on the gearbox or whatever, and clearly going into today, they swapped that gearbox out because they thought, all right, this first gearbox is not performing as we want it to, let's put another one in, and then today that also fails. Not exactly sure if it's the gearbox itself or it's the drive shaft, which I believe is, okay, so the drive shaft kind of connects the gearbox to the front wheels, but still, I guess that's part of what they consider to be the gearbox. Like when you look at the ICE or the MGUH or the MGUK or these other parts of the car, you're only allowed a certain amount of per season. I believe the drive shaft will be related to the gearbox kind of components because it is an extension of the gearbox, you could say. So yeah, whether that was the issue they were having, whether it's a slightly separate issue, because Verstappen did say to the media that this wasn't an issue they expected, but it might be another problem with said gearbox setup. Now, we haven't seen that for Red Bull or for the Alfa Tauris or for Perez, sorry, but we've seen it for Max Verstappen now in the Red Bull, and even, AMG Petronas F1 team Mercedes were saying, well, ... It's like, well, they could say this if they had a quick car again and they were actually in a championship fight, but because their car is terrible relative to the Red Bull, like, it doesn't really hit the same for Mercedes as it would a little while ago. But still, it was an exciting moment for F1 fans because it seemed so evident this weekend that it was going to be a, Perez Verstappen 1-2, or probably a 2-1 in that case, right, with Verstappen P1 and a clear victory and just straight up battle for the podium places, and it might still turn out that way, but still, Verstappen fighting through the field is going to be a challenge for him, but it's one that you still can't really rule him out of, right? I remember last year in Spa, I was like, okay, Verstappen's P14, I'm going to still give him a 50% chance to win this race, and he did so with relative ease. So even F1 data analysis looking at the telemetry says that the engine revs increased massively when the gearbox broke, so the transmission shaft, as we just mentioned, was completely destroyed, maybe, and therefore that new gearbox in has got to have another one. So there's no penalty, but more than likely for tomorrow he'll be on his third gearbox already, which might have the same flaw that we just saw happen today. So that's the real problem, and also that's why Ferrari are concerned, because they have their third electronics package in the car now, which they're taking a 10-place penalty for. before, but have they fixed the issue with the first two? Like, I don't know if they fully know that they have. So that's obviously a massive concern. Loads of, to me, it's surprising the amount of reliability concerns here, because you would think, okay, first season on the new regs, the development has gone mainly into the car itself rather than the reliability, and we saw that bite Rebel a bit at the start of last season, but from then on, the reliability was generally all right, apart from Alpine and poor Fernando Alonso, and obviously the Ferrari stuff. But I thought this season it would be significantly better, but just 2 weekends in, we've got a lot going on here, and as Verstappen says, really good weekend up until that point. It was working very well. I would have hoped to start further up, and what he basically said, yeah, I thought this quote was kind of interesting, right? It will be a bit more tricky to get to the front. So he's like, it's not like it'll be impossible to get to the front. It's like, yeah, it'll be a bit more tricky now to get to P1. Not much of a challenge, but just a bit more tricky for Verstappen, he reckons. And it's got to be said, after he got out of the car, he did have a bit of a grin on his face, right? So he obviously knows what he's got under him in this car and what potentially he can extract from said car. But whether that's enough tomorrow, we'll see. But it does at least make things interesting, because, you know, we said after the first race in Bahrain, oh, Max, you know, Russell said that Max is going to win every race of the season, and he might still do, but he might not do after the events today. So therefore, qualifying concluded. Stroll, for a brief moment, I don't really know why people thought Stroll was going to get pole, because like he had a fast Q1, a purple Q1, but it's like the Red Bull gains so much on the Aston Martins in the final two sectors on pure straight line speed. The Aston's just a bit too draggy, hurts it a lot around a circuit like this. Still, the Aston looks good, but it just loses too much in a straight line to Red Bull, and it was obvious that, you know, Lance was not going to have enough in the tank to get P1. Messed up the final sector anyway relative to his competition around him, and it's Perez on pole, not by an astonishing amount, it must be said, right? He was on pole by, well, we'll look at the numbers here just now, 1.5 tenths back to Leclerc, so Leclerc put in a really good lap in that Ferrari. Sainz was further back, about 6 tenths back, then Alonso P3. Now, of course, Leclerc's going to drop down to P12, so that will mean Perez, Alonso on the front row, then Russell P3. He had a great qualifying. He was ahead of Hamilton by consistently 2 to 3 tenths the entire run in qualifying, so don't know if that setup differences. I know there's been some discussion from Toto Wolff after the fact about the setup differences, and even Russell himself said they reckon they're set up better for the race than they are for quali, so maybe that's a bit promising for Mercedes. But Hamilton was quite a way back, and he'll start P7 tomorrow, obviously with Leclerc dropping back. Ocon was ahead of him though. Of course, Ocon versus Hamilton is going to be spicy if those cars are similar in race pace. Stroll, and then of course, well, that's basically the way the grid will line up, but Oscar Piastri, massive credit for him to get in. And that is going to do it for today. So if you want to tweet your thoughts in the comments below, hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.